What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So, our first story for today is from SpaceX and Cursor, and they're announcing that SpaceX and Cursor are working now closely together to create the world's best coding and knowledge work AI. The combination of Cursor's leading product and distribution to expert software engineers with SpaceX's million H100 equivalent Colossus training supercomputer will allow us to build the world's most useful models. Cursor has also given SpaceX the right to acquire Cursor later this year for $60 billion or pay $10 billion for our work together. So, this is super exciting. A lot of people are hating on this. They're just saying like, oh, Cursor's just a VS Code fork, and like, why is it worth 60 billion? Personally, I'm on the other side of this. I think I might just be bad at like startup math and like valuations, but they were worth 10 billion about a year ago, I think, or maybe like 18 months ago. And they're just such a useful product. Actually, personally, and we'll talk about this when we get to the tweet from the Cursor engineer, but I've actually gone back to Cursor just because I believe so much in like the file viewer. And I have been informed that Codex, and I checked it out, Codex does have a file viewer as well in the desktop app. So it is still available in some of these other competitors, but I just feel like it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a separate file viewer from the code generation using AI, because the code is still what's being run, like you can ask it questions and you can generate these markdown docs that you can read, but at the end of the day, like the agents aren't the ones who's responsible for the code to be run. But nonetheless, not to get too sidetracked, SpaceX is potentially acquiring Cursor for $60 billion, or they have to pay $10 billion for their work together, kind of like the Figma $1 billion for Adobe would be my guess. Like in case the acquisition doesn't go through. And it's just really cool, SpaceX acquired XAI, it's all coming together. The IPO is going to be massive when it happens. But yeah, there are a lot of people who say this is a bad idea and Cursor should not be valued this high. But it is crazy that like the company was founded in 2023. So in about 3 years exactly, they've managed to create a $60 billion company, which is incredible. Okay, next we have a tweet from David Kramer, who is the CTO of Sentry, and he's responding to this other tweet that was covering an interview of his that says they budgeted 15K per dev per year for AI usage, and he's saying that's not enough for heavy usage. We average it out and it's probably more than enough for us right now. They only use API usage billing, which you have to use as a business. I'm not sure exactly why they can't buy like their team like Codex, those 20x plans that give you like 20 to 30x like usage from the products themselves, but they're using API usage billing, which is like direct billing. So if you use like $200 worth of tokens, they're paying $200, as opposed to on a personal plan, you can pay $200 and get like $3,000 to $5,000 worth of tokens. And they're saying last month was 100K to 200K in spend distributed amongst Claude, Codex, Cursor, and he's using $100 to $300 per day himself. He's guessing by the end of the year, they'll be at a similar rate as today, as not everyone has the time to mess around with AI like they do, and he doesn't work on time-sensitive projects, so he can experiment more with trying to coerce the LLMs to get the results he needs. I thought this was interesting. I personally have always been like very cost-sensitive with development, and I really liked development when I first started in the late 2010s, because I was like, wow, all you need is a laptop and you can build things for free essentially, But the industry has changed a lot, and now it does cost a lot of money to generate code. It's interesting, people say like code is free now, when it actually like you had to pay for labor, and I guess that's where the differential is like if you're a solo indie developer, you don't pay for labor because you do it all yourself, but you're paying with time, which is non-renewable, obviously. So there is a piece of that. But when I was young in my teens and early 20s, it did very much feel like kind of a free job, where it's like I can develop so much value just with something that costs nothing. But now to be an indie developer, I mean, I guess you can still write the code yourself, but no one's really doing that, and it does just kind of like cost money to generate these tokens. And it's kind of like actually from an advertising perspective, you look at it where it's like these companies used to raise VC funds so that they could just give it to Facebook and Google. That was kind of a meme in the industry, where it's like now all you're doing is spending your money on OpenAI, Anthropic, and Cursor. So that is kind of interesting of like what the new winners are of this age, and those companies are now worth about $1 trillion each. Not Cursor, obviously, worth 60 billion, as we covered in the previous story, but Anthropic and OpenAI are worth about $1 trillion on the private market right now. So very interesting to see the new winners. They've grown obviously much quicker than Google and Facebook grew back in the day, but that's just kind of how it is. And it'll be interesting to see the new companies if we don't get Skynet, but very interesting to kind of get some insider ball knowledge on how much developers are spending, at least at Sentry right now. Okay, next I just wanted to give a quick update on the CalAI being removed from the App Store, because we did cover it. So it actually turned out it wasn't because of their pop-up and their in-app Stripe subscription entirely. It was partially that, because we did cover how you need to have like a ability to subscribe with in-app payments as well. That's why all of the apps have like the continue, which will take you to the website, but then also the subscribe in-app as another option as well, which will use in-app payments. So there was that it was built in was the problem. It needs to take you to an external web app to do the subscription, it seems. But also it seems like one of the reasons they were removed, and actually Apple made a statement to TechCrunch, which is pretty cool that they were being transparent about it. But this was like their second offer is what they call it, where basically if you decline the paywall, they would let you like spin this wheel, I guess, guess, to get a specific offer. And I guess this is also against Apple terms. So that was why they got removed. They've now been added back. And actually, apparently, Apple, with adding them back, removed a bunch of the copycats. So that speaks to like, being a copycat, people were saying like was very valuable when they were taken off, but you only got like 1 to 2 days of success, and they might even be refunding your customers since you are going against the terms of service. So just very interesting. And, using things like Revenue Cat, that's where it's like they're a very good product and you can really trust them to kind of like be on top of it. And they were saying that a bunch of apps were being removed for doing in-app specific Stripe-based payments, but if you do the external web link out, then you should be fine. And obviously, you can talk about Apple's monopoly and how they're, forcing you to have a worse experience to pay their tax, but compared to what it was before where you weren't even allowed to do external payments, it's definitely a step forward. Okay, next we have a tweet from Eric at Cursor saying this morning he woke up to 5 PRs that he kicked off with Cloud Agents last night. Bugbot had reviewed all of them, suggested fixes, and auto-pushed it while he was sleeping. Then another agent tested the changes to make sure they were functionally correct. Can also just spin up a bunch of agents on the same problem, see which one fixed it the best way. He can never go back to not using Cloud Agents anymore. It's changed the way he's approached problems. So I thought this was really interesting. Personally, for me, I was using OhMyPy, the Pi coding agent, which was quite popular, and it's an open source coding harness that you can wrap around like Codex or Anthropic, etc. But you can use the subscriptions. But you can use the Codex subscription because, Anthropic's been cutting down on what you can use outside of Claude Code. They only want people to use like their max subscription within Claude Code, but I was using Codex just to experiment with it. But I was having a lot of problems specifically with connecting MCPs, and that's where my colleague suggested to me to go back to Cursor, which was what I had been using in the like 2023 and 2024 and 2025 as well, was primarily Cursor for me. But then in December of 25, I switched over to Claude Code just because of the max plan and how good Opus was doing. But I did switch back to Cursor. I now have a really nice MCP set up across all my projects. So each project has its own MCP server for Atlassian, for example, because, I have a different Jira connection per project. So I can't just have one Atlassian MCP through the marketplace. I need to have an individual server all with their own OAuth, but that's actually working really well through Cursor. And I do like how well it adheres to the rules, which is why I liked Pi coding agent as well, because I felt like Claude Code never really adhered to skills and rules as well. So I'm on it. I have ran out of like my team usage, so I might have to ask the company to increase that, or, I'm not mad at using the auto model as well, even though I know a lot of people think it's pretty bad, but I haven't gotten back on using Cloud Agents yet. And I did feel really overwhelmed, especially like when the Ralph loops were happening, where, just running something overnight and then reviewing it in the morning did seem like kind of overwhelming to me, and like building out all these features. But maybe that's more of a skill issue on my end, and I just have to get back to it. But I do really kind of still like the synchronous coding where I'm like focused on one project and just building out like the specific feature I'm working on or the bug fix I'm working on, and then reviewing the code and then like pushing that through, kind of like how it was done previously. But there is a lot of updating I probably still need to do to get on the same page with all of these like state-of-the-art coding processes that are now available and kind of how people are looking at developing software. Okay, next we have a tweet from GitHub that's pretty interesting, kind of like some old school development blog coming out of them, just talking about how they optimize their file change page, which is like for PR review. And it's pretty cool. Basically what they did, kind of lay out the base ideas, but definitely take a look at the blog if you want more details. So first of all, they removed a lot of the specific HTML elements, and they're using React under the hood, but they removed a lot of the specific HTML elements per line. So they had about 8, as you can see here, React components, and I think they had about 13 HTML or DOM elements per line. So that was using like spans and code blocks to render each line, basically, with the line numbers and all of that. So they removed a lot of the code blocks, and they made it more of a unified component for rendering each line. Then they also added the JS maps, as you can see here. So instead of doing a lot of like O of N queries, they were doing O of 1 queries. So you do have to build the map at first, but then all of the queries, which I'm sure they're doing a lot of when they're rendering, went down a lot. And then also they had virtualization, which is using TanStack to just make sure that, for 10,000 line file changes, they can only render what's needed, and kind of like a game engine type visualization. And yeah, pretty cool. They covered a bunch of the metrics as well, and it kind of speaks as well to like, when you're following best practices for React or just anything in general, it's like, okay, I want to have really small functions, I want to have reusable components, I want everything to be super clean. But then you run into these issues where it's like, from a performance perspective, it's like you kind of abstracted at the wrong level, right? So they were abstracting at like the per line basis, and they were adding a bunch of event handlers, for example, to each line for like on mouse over for highlighting and stuff like that. But then they realized that like, oh, well, when we have 10,000 lines, we're rendering 10,000 event handlers, So they switched to a data attribute field on the component, so they can just have one event handler at the top level to realize what's being highlighted. And just one of those things, I guess it's like an abstraction layer issue, but, it's not always like making the smallest components that are the most reusable is the best practice. It's really about figuring out what is the isolated deliverable that we're figuring out here to really make a performant application. And it just comes with iteration as well. That's why I like speak a lot on like focusing on one project and things like that, because, if you're like bouncing around to like a bunch of different projects using AI, it's really hard to focus on these optimizations and build like really nice experiences, and your users can definitely tell when something's a bit finicky. So just kind of interesting, and definitely like kind of an old school blog, so I would definitely recommend checking it out. Okay, and then lastly we have a pretty funny one from Theo, where basically there was a bunch of news that came out. I was going to cover it yesterday, but it's kind of good I held off on it because Anthropic actually had removed Claude Code as an option from the Pro, which is the $20 per month plan, on their site, and there was a huge, drama because of that. People were like, okay, well now you have to pay $200 a month to use Claude Code, and people that had paid for yearly Claude Code who were not able to use it anymore. And Anthropic though came out and they said that only 2% of new users, I forget exactly who it wasn't Tariq or Boris, but it was one of the Anthropic engineers or one of the Anthropic employees. He came out and said that only 2% of new users were supposed to see the Claude Code requires max tier change, but 100% of users saw it. And Theo's like, they were either lying or bad at coding. We've now confirmed it's the latter. Man, these guys are terrible at writing code. And just kind of interesting. I never really ran into a bunch of Claude Code bugs, but I do know people think that Claude Code is like a really bad app. And I always thought that the Claude iOS app was really poorly written, just with different things, especially with like the speaking to it. It wouldn't like stop at the right time, or it would like auto stop even while you were still talking. Presumably to save compute, but still like a pretty bad user experience. And I haven't used it for a couple months, so I can't really speak on how much has changed. But, this does kind of give us hope that like, okay, we haven't fully been replaced by AI, because these guys are using the top models to write their code, and they're still writing a bunch of trash, according to Theo and a lot of other people on Twitter. You kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, because we don't really know how good these projects are individually. And, people run into different edge cases. It's one of those things where it's like, even if 0.001% of people have a certain bug, if you have tens of millions of users, then a bunch of people are going to run into that. And that's just kind of part of the game, but pretty funny, pretty interesting. So Claude Code is available back on the Pro plan, and they restored it. Who knows what they're going to do in the future moving forward. They might take it away. And I think there was an internal memo. I'm not sure exactly who spoke on it, but they did basically say that like Pro and the Max plan were specifically for chatters, so they don't necessarily feel that you're entitled to Claude Code by paying for these plans, and that might just need to be charged at the API level. And maybe that's why the Sentry CTO was saying that they use the API for business, maybe for some of these politics reasons, but nonetheless pretty funny and interesting. This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.